You're about to see exactly how a small tax collection department grew to become a billion-dollar federal agency. You will see how this agency maximizes its growth and budget by aggressively interpreting laws and by targeting individuals and small businesses for prosecution. Intimidation of innocent citizens, pointless paperwork prosecutions, manufacturing evidence, unwritten procedures, lethal publicity stunts. These are the legacy of an overgrown, overpowered agency. Mesa, Arizona. A federal agency learns that a licensed firearms dealer did not get a city permit to sell used property.
Police! ATL! Police! Anybody inside? Police! Police!
Federal agents confiscate his entire inventory. Although they drop charges, the dealer's business is ruined. It could have been worse. BATF incompetence and self-seeking led to the most lethal law enforcement operation in America's history, an operation that left 4 agents and almost 85 civilians dead. Waco, Texas. A federal agency hears about neighbors reporting possible full automatic gunfire near a residence and church known as Mount Carmel. 80 heavily armed agents raid the building, while others swoop past in helicopters. Shots ring out, and the agents open fire.
911, what's your emergency?
There are 75 men around our building shooting at us.
Just a moment.
This Lynch. Hello? Hello?
There's 75 men circling.
Hello? 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 Yeah, this is Lieutenant Lynch. May I help you? Yeah, there are 75 men around our building, and they're shooting at us in Mount Carmel. Mount Carmel? Yeah, tell them there are children and women in here and to call it off. All right. Hello? I hear gunfire. Oh, shit. Hello? Who is this? Hello? Call it off! Who is this? Hello? Hello? Oh, my.
A 51-day government siege of the building ends with an armored assault that gasses the people inside and demolishes much of the building. A fire breaks out, and almost 85 civilians die. 2 agents are fired. After they threaten to tell the real story about headquarters involvement, they are reinstated with full back pay. Stephen Higgins said that agents were shot at before they got to the house. But agents on the ground were, in fact, greeted by an unarmed David Koresh. But no one can spend all their time at work. BATF agents must have time to relax, too. 1995. Congress investigates the annual Good Old Boys Roundup, where BATF agents held a drunken retreat at a rural location near Ocoee, Tennessee. The Office of Inspector General also investigated.
We found substantial evidence that the campground was a hostile environment for women, especially in the later years of the roundup. Even male attendees told us they would not have wanted any female family member or friend to attend the roundup because of how women were treated. Apparently, the same concern and solicitude did not extend to the relatively few female law enforcement personnel who went to a roundup. Performances in the skit competitions included participants who bit off the head of a dead snake, ate a whole raw fish soaked in beer, defecated on stage, soiled their trousers on stage, and pulled chewing tobacco out of their trousers, pretending it to be excrement, and put it in their mouths. For a period of time, substantial effort was made to see who could be the most vile and disgusting.
It hears testimony that black agents were kept out with crude signs and that the event sold T-shirts with Martin Luther King's face under rifle crosshairs and an appalling fake hunting license. Just who do these people think they are? Can a government organization quickly rise from obscurity to become a billion-dollar agency? The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, more commonly known as the ATF, did just that. The problem is that it climbed to power on the back of American gun owners. To trace the origins of the ATF, we have to go back 80 years to the Prohibition era. From 1919 to 1933, all sale of liquor was outlawed in the United States. It was the noble experiment of Prohibition. The experiment proved a complete disaster, as organized crime and amateur distillers took over the business of booze. The government established something called the Prohibition Unit in the Internal Revenue Service, and the Prohibition Unit set to raiding underground distilleries, or stills, with a vengeance. When Prohibition ended, the Prohibition Unit went back to collecting taxes on liquor and tobacco, in the process raiding moonshiners who didn't pay taxes. The unit was renamed the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Unit.
Congress, when it passed the first major Firearms Act back in 1934, the National Firearms Act, passed it as a way to regulate machine guns and a few other firearms, and did it as an excise tax, so that way you would have to register the gun when you paid the excise tax. Since there was no logical other place to put it, they put this responsibility with the Internal Revenue Service, its Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Division, that along the side also enforced a few machine gun laws. Thereafter, it stayed with Treasury up until very recently when it was transferred to Justice. The idea being that since it started with the Treasury Agency as a tax collecting thing, all subsequent federal firearms things were assigned to what eventually became the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, but originally started out as a subdivision of the IRS.
The criminal gangs of the 1930s fell in love with the new Thompson submachine gun. In 1934, Congress enacted the first serious federal gun control, the National Firearms Act, which imposed a tax on transfer of machine guns and other specialty guns. By paying the tax, the new owner registered himself as the machine gun's owner. Since the National Firearms Act was created to tax gun transfers, the Internal Revenue Service became the law's enforcer. IRS gave the enforcement job to its Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Unit. But that unit's main business remained busting moonshiners. Its gun responsibilities were so minor that the unit never bothered changing its name to include the word firearms. Throughout this period, most of the 20th century, federal involvement in firearms regulation was trivial. Who knows if even one federal employee did full-time work investigating gun cases? To understand what increased federal government involvement, we have to go back to the halcyon days of the 1950s and the early 1960s. Guns, including military surplus bolt actions, could be ordered freely through the mail. Prices were cheap, and hobbyists could trim down the stocks on military guns to make them into good deer rifles for about $40. If someone were willing to spend more money, he could even get a cannon. Hunters were happy, and gun collectors ecstatic. Crime rates were very low. In 1960, the violent crime rate was about 1/3 what it is today. One group that wasn't happy was the firearm manufacturers. The manufacturers saw $40 mail-order deer rifles as cheap competition. Their trade group began to push for laws that would cut off the competition. Connecticut was then the center of gun manufacturing, so it's natural the manufacturers turned to Senator Tom Dodd of that state. The gun manufacturers wanted a bill that would outlaw importation of surplus guns and outlaw mail-order sales by forcing gun owners to buy from licensed dealers in their own state. Dodd was a natural choice in another sense. He was one of the most corrupt men ever to hold a Senate seat. His embezzlement of campaign funds would lead to his becoming the first member censured by the Senate in a decade. Dodd was also rather lazy. When he came to draft his gun control bill, he found a way to copy it from an existing example.
The burning question always has been, where did Dodd get the language for his Gun Control Act? He was trying to create a new federal scheme that had never existed before. There was nothing that could be used as a model. Most people might assume that Senator Dodd sat down and with a lot of hard work designed the Gun Control Act of 1968 from scratch. Simply not true. And 20 years after the Gun Control Act was enacted, one of our members told us, having seen long ago, an article arguing that the Gun Control Act read suspiciously like the Nazi weapons law. Dodd was an attorney who had spent over a year in Germany, right after World War II, serving with the Nuremberg trials. So he might well have known of the Nazi gun laws. We managed to track down a copy of the Nazi weapons law of 1938 and had it translated. The parallels were astonishing. But while we had strong suspicions, we still had no hard proof that Dodd knew of the Nazi law. Then, a stroke of luck. An historian alerted Jews for the preservation of firearms ownership to the smoking gun that proved that Senator Dodd knew of the law and had his own copy. In the record of Dodd's committee hearings, he had found a letter in which the Library of Congress that responded to Senator Dodd's request for a translation of Nazi gun laws, including the weapons law of 1938. The Library of Congress's response noted that Tom Dodd himself had already found and sent to them his own copy of the Nazi gun laws. As I've said, there were striking similarities between portions of the Gun Control Act and the Nazi gun laws. All gun manufacturers and dealers were to be licensed. They were to sell only from their premises. They had to maintain bound books reflecting acquisitions and dispositions with entries exactly paralleling those American gun dealers must keep. And these were subject to police inspection. When they went out of business, they had to turn the books into the government, just as an American gun dealer must do. Senator Dodd had plagiarized the Nazi gun laws in order to create the Gun Control Act of 1968.
Nummer 22.
Whoever professionally acquires, sells, or otherwise disposes of handguns, or whoever professionally offers to acquire or to dispose of such items, must maintain a firearms dealer's book in which the origin and disposal of handguns must occur. The business owner is required to keep the book until 10 years have elapsed after the date of the last entry. If the business owner ceases to do business, he must turn over the book he has maintained to the local police authority for safekeeping.
At that time, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms in St. Louis had an agent in charge. Not long after my meeting, they dropped that position. The man who was my friend got promoted, went to Washington. I was in his office for a meeting. I don't recall the topic, it doesn't matter. I had a professional relationship with him, a friendship with him, if you will, because we both belonged to an investigative association here in St. Louis. He presented me with a copy of the 1968 Gun Control Act. It was in a binder with the full-color logo of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms on the cover. That was my segue to ask him if he had knowledge and if he knew the original source material for the 1968 Gun Control Act, that it came from the 1938 Nazi gun laws. He would not give me a direct answer. He danced around answering me. And finally, when I pushed and wouldn't give up, he finally said, "Yes, I know, so what?" How common this knowledge is within the BATF, I couldn't say. I couldn't address that issue since I'm not inside that culture of that agency. Now, clearly the man I talked to was at a high position. He had an extensive career, and he was in a management supervisory position. And he knew. Whether the average agent on the street knows or not, I wouldn't have that knowledge.
JPFO released its discovery in the book, Gun Control Gateway to Tyranny, in 1992. What amazed us, and amazes us to this day, is that some Jewish legislators are stalwarts of the anti-gun movement. For example, Charles Schumer, Dianne Feinstein, Barbara Boxer, Carl Levin, Frank Lautenberg, and many others. And none has ever responded or shown the slightest concern over the fact that America's gun laws were copied from those of Hitler's government. Actually, we think every true American would be outraged that the American Congress would adopt a Nazi-like law for any reason.
After the Gun Control Act was enacted, its enforcement was given to the Treasury Department. Within a few years, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax Unit of IRS became a separate Treasury agency in its own right, renamed the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. The new agency set out to expand its mission and its size, and it wasn't too choosy about its methods.
I can't tell you what percentage of the recent cases are based upon entrapment. I can tell you when I was doing most of the widespread investigations where you get a sense of proportion in past years, I would say upwards of 50% of the ATF cases were based upon something that was either entrapment or so close that you'd have to take it to a jury and let them decide. Where you had a person who didn't start out to break the law, but was either enticed into making a technical violation so they could bust him, or as in the case of Randy Weaver, where it wasn't a technical violation, he knew it was breaking the law, but they were offering him an enormous amount of money and he was basically starving on the edge of existence. He wouldn't have broken the law but for the fact that they were out there offering him several $100s per gun to make an illegal gun.
I've found that the ATF has a nasty habit of using convicted felons, drug dealers, murderers, wife beaters, people of that ilk, as their sources of information, and even putting those felons on the witness stand as their primary witness in gun prosecutions, which I find to be despicable.
Of course, the big problem with entrapment is you're supposed to be preventing a crime, not aiding it. Let me give you something on Randy Weaver. You know, the Randy Weaver case is really interesting, and I think it illustrates ATF's view of informants in a way. ATF entrapped Randy Weaver into selling some illegal shotguns, not because they thought Weaver was engaged in any illegal conduct, but because they wanted Weaver to become an informant for them and infiltrate a gang that they thought was, and it was, highly dangerous. Well, the agent wasn't going to put his tail on the line to infiltrate them. He wanted Weaver. Weaver refused to do it. So what do? You entrap Weaver. Get an innocent guy, entrap him, so now you can threaten him with going to prison for 5 or 10 years, and now you can send him in to do the dirty work and the dangerous work, infiltrating the guys you really wanted to investigate in the first place. That often happened in the cases I saw back in the 70s and 80s, where you would, usually it wasn't so egregious as this, but once you busted a few people after you entrapped 1 or 2, you would then force them to entrap their friends, or would you like a felony rap and go to prison for several years. So it got to where a lot of gun collectors saying they can't trust anybody anymore. That guy who's calling up, offering to buy that collector's piece, maybe working for ATF and trying to set you up, because otherwise he goes to prison.
I have found over the years of defending people that the BATF usually targets the little guy, the one who can least likely afford trial counsel and counsel who knows what they're doing with regard to weapons cases. They typically pick on people that attend gun shows, people that make guns in their homes, people that repair guns, and they target those type of people for prosecution.
The agency started off its enforcement with a raid that left an innocent civilian ruined for life.
Back in 1968-69, right after the Gun Control Act was enacted, ATF started off on what I think became its course of conduct. They raided a fellow named Kenyon Ballou in the Maryland suburbs of Washington. He worked for the Washington Post as a pressman. They got a warrant which basically was perjured. I mean, it had statements in that were totally untrue. It was based on the word of a burglar who had been captured, and to get out of his charges, cooked up the story about Ballou. They put in there things like that he was a reliable informant because he tipped off police as to 3 burglaries. No, he confessed to 3 of his own burglaries. They went in, smashed down Ballou's door at night. The first people in were undercover narcotics agents who looked like junkies. So Ballou sees junkies breaking into his house in the middle of the night, waving guns. He took up a cabin ball revolver, and they blew him away. He took a bullet through the brain. He survived, but was basically paralyzed, ruined for life, not unlike Jim Brady. ATF then announced they were investigating their own shooting, took axes, cut out chunks of the wall where the bullets had penetrated, packed all of his belongings into a trailer and carted it away, and then eventually washed their hands of the case. And it was covered up. They had a full Treasury report that concluded that, well, minor mistakes were made, but that's all. I mean, that's how you start off an agency on a course like this. No matter what you do, even if you shoot a civilian without justification, we'll decide that you did the right thing.
The agents responsible for the raid on Kenyon Ballou were given promotions. ATF investigated the case and concluded its agents had done nothing wrong. Abuse, cover-up, and promotion set a pattern for the agency that would continue.
Probably one of the worst abuses I've ever seen in years of looking at it involved a disabled veteran in New Hampshire who was raided by ATF. They had sent in an informant who was subject to a criminal charge and was working it off. And he said he saw an M14 in the gunsmith's shop. ATF went in, raided him, cleaned out his whole shop, which had been set up for him by veterans, the VA, as rehabilitation, hauled him off and charged him with a felony, possession of fully automatic weapon. They went to trial on it, and it was so bad that at the end of the trial, the judge, who was himself a disabled veteran, was visibly red in the face. It closed the prosecution's case, told the defendant to stand up, and read him an apology on behalf of the United States for what had been done to him, and announced he was dismissing the case. For the first time in his career, he was dismissing a criminal case at the end of the prosecution's case. And then he chewed out the prosecutor on the record. The veteran's wife later encountered a member of the jury in the grocery store, and the member of the jury said, "It's too bad the judge dismissed the case because we'd already decided to vote to acquit." This is halfway through the trial. They're not supposed to be doing that. I mean, but it totally ruined his business.
The BATF also threatens gun owners with prosecution if they don't give up their friends and their family who may or may not be involved in some type of illegal activity. They use threats such as 10 years in prison for a violation of various gun laws when they know, in fact, that no violation has occurred. And they'll use that information to target other individuals which may or may not be conducting any illegal activity.
ATF agents came to feel so powerful that they set out to intimidate writers who portrayed the agency in a bad light. John Ross authored a novel entitled Unintended Consequences that portrayed ATF as a thuggish and abusive agency.
The name of my novel is Unintended Consequences, and the story is about a man that we see in the book from childhood to early middle age, growing up impassioned in the gun culture. And one day, or one night I should say. In late evening, he uses his shooting skills to stop what he believes is an armed robbery. And when he interrogates the survivors, he discovers to his horror that he has stopped not an armed robbery, but an illegal federal raid where the agents were planning to plant evidence and use the asset forfeiture laws to send a man to prison. And we get a very interesting story, I think, about this. And what has bothered some people is that I've used so many real-life examples of government abuse in the course of the story. I didn't have to make them up. I used things that have actually happened and that are documented. In about 1997, I'm not sure of the exact month, but in that year, there started to be a lot of rumors around the gun culture that the ATF was taking notice of my book. And the way I became aware of these rumors was from the internet discussion groups that centered around the recreational shooting and collecting of guns. And I started hearing reports that different vendors at gun shows in several different states, I believe it was incidents happened in 4 different states, where people identifying themselves as ATF agents, now whether they were or not, I don't know, but people identifying themselves to a seller at a gun show as ATF agents were seeing that they were selling my book and they were threatening them with unspecified problems if they continued to sell my book. And the result of my publisher and I learning about these different incidents was that my publisher posted a full-page ad offering a $10,000 reward for anyone's information that led to the arrest and conviction of a federal agent abusing his authority in this manner. Many people have asked me if I believe that these threats that happened to various sellers were made by actual ATF agents or were they people pretending to be ATF agents. I don't think that any of the incidents involved someone pretending to be an ATF agent, because that's a serious crime. It's a serious crime to impersonate a federal agent. And I don't see anybody doing that just to get their kicks, talking about scaring someone off from selling a book.
To understand how ATF got involved in these abuses, you have to be a bureaucrat. I was GS 14, step 5. I'm a bureaucrat, I know what they think. Think of the agency as a living thing. It must expand and grow. It must not die off or sicken. And if you're a bureaucrat, you're totally loyal to that thing. So how do you make your agency grow? And the answer, if it's a small law enforcement agency, is more arrests, more seizures. Congress will give you more money for that. ATF's now approaching $1 billion a year in budget, I believe. They want to keep that growing. So the result is that middle-level management and upper management will pressure agents, give us more results. We want to see more raids, we want to see more arrests, we want to see more seizures, and we want to see more good publicity. That's the biggest operative factor. Then you get, how do you get those seizures and raids and things like that? Well, you can generate a lot of numbers just by calling up your local police and saying, whenever you arrest a guy with a gun and a felony rap, send me the form and I'll fill out a cover letter and send it to the U.S. attorney and we'll charge him with being a felon in illegal possession of a gun. The problem is you can't get promoted on that because within the bureaucracy, the basis for your promotion is that you are handling increasingly complex issues. Well, that's a job your secretary could do, attach a cover letter to a police report and send it over there. So if you generate a lot of cases involving convicted felons getting caught, you'll never get promoted. So the only way to solve your agency mission and get yourself promoted is to make a lot of cases involving something that sounds complicated. Well, felon in possession isn't that, but your local gun dealer is. Your local gun show, your gun collectors, now you can make that sound like you've got 10 or 20 people engaged in illicit conduct and you had to go undercover to investigate them. Now you get your promotion.
Unfortunately, thinking like a bureaucrat can cost lives. In 1993, that happened at Waco, Texas.
How much of the ATF raid on the Davidians was motivated by simple publicity is illustrated first by the operating code that began the raid, which was showtime. It's showtime was the code to begin. But the second is through Freedom of Information Act, I got a video taken inside their raid headquarters as they are preparing for the raid. These are not people who are ready to storm an enemy-held building. They're not expecting it. This is all a big show. They're laughing, they're joking, they're reading the Sunday paper, they're having a good time, they're taking commemorative pictures of each other. They're expecting this to be a gigantic pushover, and they're just there with the 3 helicopters and 80 guys and submachine guns to put on a big show for the media cameras.
ATF covered its tracks by portraying Koresh and his followers as fanatic cop killers. But the tape of a call that Koresh made to an ATF agent after Koresh was shot in the raid suggests they were not killers at all and had no hatred of law enforcement. Although he was badly wounded by the agent's bullets, Koresh is quite friendly to the ATF agent.
All right, guys, like I say, it would have been better if you just called me up or talked to me. Then y'all could have come in and done your work after. I would have told you this deal. I was telling Robert, I told him this morning, I said, look, because, like I said, I had this vision. And I told him, I said, Robert, I said, you got to do what you got to do. Yes, sir.
Usually, of course, ATF activities do not leave about 85 civilians dead, as they did at Waco. But the way ATF usually uses the powers of the government, powers given and paid for by you and me, is not pretty.
The BATF is always very restrictive in their interpretation of the gun laws. If you call up an ATF agent and tell them you plan to do something with regard to gun ownership or building guns, they will invariably tell you what you're doing is illegal, when in fact it's probably not.
ATF has enormous legal powers over machine guns. Possession of an unregistered machine gun, or of any machine gun made after 1986, is a federal felony that can bring up to 10 years imprisonment. To ATF, almost anything can be an illegal machine gun. When some people purchased parts kits whose receivers had been cut up, with important parts cut off and discarded so they could not be put back together, ATF exerted itself to prove these were still machine guns.
This is a PPS H-41, Soviet manufactured, that was marketed by a parts kit. As you can see, the barrel shroud and the muzzle brake have been torch cut off. The center section of the receiver has been torch cut and bandsaw cut.
Never mind that sometimes the alleged machine guns fell apart while being fired. And to claim other cut-up part sets were machine guns, ATF had to weld them back together and then redesign the monstrosity so that it would finally shoot.
The weapon has been bandsaw cut at this location through the magazine well, behind the ejector lock assembly, with the tailpiece missing. In order to restore this to fully firing condition, 2 small tack welds were made at both sides of the cut here, and a tail section was manufactured from scrap metal and welded to the back of the ejector block. We welded the forward sections of the receivers where they'd been torch cut here and bandsaw cut here. As you can see, the cuts were made with a bandsaw, removing the center section of the receiver. In order to restore this firearm to function as a fully automatic firearm, we manufactured a feed ramp using JB epoxy weld. We welded a piece of metal bar stock to the top of the firearm to hold the bolt in place. And we manufactured a small ejector to the back of the magazine to function because the ejector in this particular gun was removed when the center section was removed from the torch cut.
This practice of attaching a foreign object to a semi-automatic firearm or to just another object or a firearm component is extremely important. The ATF has declared that the use of an ordinary item used to induce fully automatic fire is in and of itself a conversion device, therefore a machine gun. Why is this important? The ATF themselves, in their scientific testing methods, are attaching foreign devices to semi-automatic firearms and to firearms devices in order to rig the test for a false positive and prosecute people.
It's as if you bought a toaster, then found you'd been sold metal scrap, and not even a complete set of scrap at that.
Customer service.
Hi, I bought a toaster from your company, and I'm just opening the box right now, and there's a bunch of scrap metal basically in the box.
Yeah, that sounds like our toaster.
But there isn't even a heating element that I can see. It's missing parts. I can't make toast with this.
Well, you could probably go to a hardware store and buy the parts and maybe take it to a metal shop to get it all together, but with some experimenting and rewiring, you'll be toasting bread.
Sir, this is not a toaster.
But you got a toaster. I'm failing to see your problem.
This is not a toaster.
Ma'am, it is a toaster.
Of course, one big difference is you can't go to jail for 10 years for owning a toaster, as you can for owning an unregistered machine gun. Supposedly to sort things out, ATF has a technical branch, one of whose jobs is to examine guns and gun-related accessories and declare whether they are machine guns.
In my experience, I found that the ATF is not interested in finding the truth. They're more interested in keeping the conviction rates up against gun owners.
In fact, the Congressional Research Service looked into ATF testing procedures and found the agency had no standards for the tests. If the technical branch could get a gun to fire 2 or more shots per trigger pull, no matter what they had to do to it or how rarely it happened, that was good enough for ATF. It is legal in most states to own a machine gun if a person obtains a federal permit. Several 100,000 Americans, including rocker Ted Nugent, have chosen to do so. If shooting is fun, shooting a machine gun is still more fun, and it keeps ammunition manufacturers in business. BATF, though, has enormous legal powers over owners of machine guns. In ATF's view, almost anything could be a machine gun, as gun owner John Glover found out. He owned some FN FAL semi-automatic rifles.
My first contact with the ATF was one afternoon about 5 o'clock. They knocked on my front door and asked if they could come in and ask me some questions. And me, feeling I had nothing to hide, said, sure. And then they came in and asked numerous questions for about an hour. Then 6 months later, after the initial meeting I had with them at my house, he came back and said, I don't want to do this, but my superior officers told me that I have to confiscate those guns. And he said that he told him that he should have confiscated them the first day he was there, 6 months prior. Okay. Even though they field tested them and they were, field tested legal. The charges the ATF brought against me were possession of a legal machine gun and 6 semi-automatic assault weapons. It really startled me. I was very upset. Couldn't believe that, because I'd not done anything like that. And here they are, I'm reading on their indictment that they're charging me with building an illegal machine gun. It pretty much blew me away.
ATF claimed it had tested one of his guns, and it had fired full automatic, making it a machine gun. Fortunately, Glover went to a good attorney and hired a firearms expert.
This technician tried in vain to make this weapon that he claimed to be fully automatic fire more than one shell at a time. And after some 15 tries, it finally did. It fired 3 shells with one pull of the trigger.
Attorney Whitesides retained expert Len Savage, a firearms manufacturer. They challenged the ATF expert to make Glover's rifle fire full auto, that is, more than one shot per trigger pull. ATF took up the challenge and was left with egg on its face.
We're here today outside of Charlotte, North Carolina at a police range. My name is Mike Cooney, and I'm with ATF in Washington, D.C., and we're going to test fire a rifle from a report that I wrote about a year and a half ago in October of 2002, where I was submitted 7 FAL type rifles from Special Agent James J. Berger from Charlotte ATF field office, and one of the rifles were down here today to shoot with the defense experts and defense team that I'd classified as a machine gun from my initial examination and report that I wrote last October of 2002. So,
after testing the gun in semi-auto, the ATF expert loaded 3 rounds, set the selector to full auto, and fired.
I'm going to put the selector position to the full auto position.
One shot, and then a jam. Just for ATF's information, this is how a machine gun is supposed to fire. And this is how a completely lawful semi-auto rifle fires. The ATF expert kept trying.
It's in the full auto position with 3 rounds loaded.
Finally, after many tries, the rifle fired 3 shots.
Be
careful, that's going off out of battery.
Yep, you're right.
That's a malfunction. That gun is malfunctioning to the point where it could harm you.
It turned out that the ATF firearms expert had never looked inside the rifle.
Is there a possibility that there could be powder fouling around the firing pin spring?
Well, we go in there and look. I didn't take it apart.
Did you happen to check and see if the firing pin spring was intact?
I did not.
Okay.
Because the weapons fired, they function properly, so.
Or malfunction. Well, they're firing out of battery, that's not functioning properly.
Well, it's firing on hammer, what's called hammer follow down.
Which
I don't want to argue with you on it. We can argue with it.
Oh, no, not arguing. I'm just, if it's, that's the reason for the safety sear, is it not, when it's in full auto, to make sure that you don't have an out of battery ignition? I think we're going to find a broken firing pin, retainer spring, or it's going to be fouled. Because the gun's malfunctioning.
Well, that's your opinion.
What the gun expert Len Savage found was that the firing pin spring was disintegrating, allowing the rifle to occasionally malfunction and fire multiple shots.
And what's happening is the firing pin is allowed to protrude further back than it should be. And at that point, with the spring being broken down, even in a minute amount, even when it didn't fire, they were getting primer strikes, which shouldn't happen. Which means this thing is allowed to free float, gain velocity, overcome the tension of the spring, and protrude out the front, and you get a string fire. Whether it would do it more than 3 rounds, I don't know, but it's a highly dangerous practice because the gun is malfunctioning to the point where it could be fatal. As I said before, the firearm's malfunctioning. We ran a high risk of an out-of-battery fire out there, which would have damaged the firearm and injured Agent Cooney.
Mr. Savage took the weapon into his possession and disassembled it and found that the problem was not something that John Glover had done, but it was a malfunctioning firing pin spring that had deteriorated because of use. That meant that the firing problem with this particular weapon was not by design, but was simply a malfunction. The ATF agent admitted on videotape that he had never disassembled that weapon, or that he had even took the time to find out why the weapon may have fired more than one shot at a time. Following the testing, which we videotaped, I sent the videotape to the Assistant U.S. Attorney, who reviewed it and issued a dismissal of all charges against Mr. Glover. We later petitioned the same Assistant U.S. Attorney to return John's guns to him, which they did.
Glover's expert Len Savage quickly found he would pay a price for embarrassing ATF. Mr. Savage's business manufactured a new product that enabled a legal machine gun to change calibers. He had sent a sample to the ATF technical branch, and they had ruled it was not itself a machine gun, nor even a gun. After his testimony, however, the technical branch announced it had reconsidered its opinion. It was now proclaiming his part was both a gun and a machine gun, and could not be sold. The ATF technical branch also announced that Mr. Savage's future requests for determination of whether an invention or product was legal would receive special consideration.
Sterling Nixon, a firearms technology branch, told me that I was no longer allowed to contact him or to talk to him. I am a licensed firearms manufacturer. My livelihood depends on communication with the ATF. I want to read from you a letter from the Assistant Director of the ATF. A telephone number has been solely dedicated for federally licensed importers and manufacturers of firearms and ammunition to address your technical questions regarding firearms and ammunition. The telephone number is 304-260-5476. Yet when I call this number now, I'm told that they're not allowed to talk to me and they hang up. Without any legislation, without any due process in court, this amounts to nothing but an economic sanction against me and my company. Orders approaching $500,000 have been canceled. Designs and all research and development have completely stopped, and my company's been devastated by the actions of the ATF.
It isn't just those who testify against ATF who are victims of ever-changing regulations and rulings. A firearms distributor sold a deactivated parts kit with approval of ATF. 6 years later, ATF changed its position and demanded that those parts be returned within 3 weeks, without compensation to the purchaser. It isn't just machine guns that are subject to ATF's arbitrary rulings and legal determinations. In fact, to ATF, almost anything could be a firearm. Richard Salata learned that it is legal for a person to make a gun for his own use. So he began selling partially manufactured rifle receivers. Buyers had to take the item, finish machining it, drill and tap screw holes, buy the barrel, trigger, and other parts, and assemble them to make a rifle. An ATF raid put an end to that product.
Well, in the first thing in the morning, I went to the sheriff's office, and the ATF, FBI were in there. They held me there for half an hour, asked me some questions, showed me the warrant. In that time, they were raiding the house while I was down there to make sure that their officers were safe, and I was out of the building. Then when I came back, we got back to the building around 9:30, and the SWAT team had already been through the house to clear it, which I didn't actually see that. But they did have a helicopter flying around over the building while I was there. They also had 2 snipers up on the hill, I was told. Back at my building, at my shop, they interrogated me a little bit, and they were asking again about the subversive information that I had. The 2 constitutional study courses and the 2 DVDs on Innocence Betrayed and BTAFE fails the test.
We might wonder why the agents were so concerned about his watching Innocence Betrayed. Innocence Betrayed is a video documentary that tells the story of several modern genocides and how gun confiscation in each country made the genocide possible. For some reason, the agents found the story disturbing.
They kept asking why I kept watching that and if I believed all that information. And again, I repeated that, asking them if they believed everything that the government told them about, and they repeated yes, that they did.
With a host of ambiguous laws upon which to rely, ATF is free to proclaim almost anything a gun or a machine gun, even your shoestrings.
The ATF has decided that a shoelace right here can be a machine gun. And what this shoelace could be done is it could be tied around the trigger, around the pistol grip, and to the cocking handle of a semi-automatic firearm. And when you do this, it will induce fully automatic fire. It is extremely dangerous, it could kill you, and would not be controllable. And the ATF has in writing declared that a shoelace is a machine gun.
How does ATF get away with this? Remember, it has no standards for testing.
Without a written standardized testing procedure, this appears to infringe upon people's rights to due process. The ATF has and can compose a test to arbitrarily come up with a false positive or a reason to prosecute. In October 2005, the Congressional Research Service published a memorandum that documents the fact that the ATF does not have a written testing standard. Here's what the ATF wrote to me about this on March 2nd, 2006, and I want to make sure I get this right, so let me quote it directly from the letter. ATF does not have a firearms testing manual addressing procedures for the classification of every firearm. The Firearms Technology Branch has for many years utilized established procedures for testing firearms. These procedures are part of every firearm enforcement officer's on-the-job training. At this time, the Firearms Technology Branch is in the process of converting these procedures into written form. This begs the question, who is overseeing the writing of these procedures now, and how are they going to affect our rights?
In light of ATF's arbitrary testing that could put an innocent gun owner in prison for 10 years, Representative Phil Gingrey introduced a bill that would require ATF to videotape every test. It seems like a modest proposal, but Representative James Sensenbrenner, an ATF ally, made sure the proposal died in committee. ATF remains free to conduct its testing off the record. And who is doing the testing?
One time I did have people within the ATF who would cooperate with me and give me inside information. But since Sterling Nixon has taken over Firearms Technical Branch, anybody with a conscience has either transferred out or been forced to retire.
The agency's arbitrariness isn't limited to testing. In the eyes of ATF, almost any gun collector could be an unlicensed gun dealer. And being a dealer without a license is a felony.
They're really taking honest individuals and turning them into criminals. The game has really changed. It's no longer the crooks versus the honest people. It's the game of what the government agency is allowed to do. If they're allowed to lie to the grand jury and obtain indictments, then they can lie at trial, and to them it's just a matter of a conviction game.
But what about people who legally own a machine gun, who had paid the tax, had been approved by local police, had passed an FBI fingerprint check, and had filed their registration form? Surely someone who'd jumped through all these legal hoops was safe from ATF prosecution. Or maybe not. ATF has known for 30 years that its database of gun registrations is in terrible shape. In 1975, its own employees worried that this fact might come out and destroy the credibility of its registration system. The ATF agents who wrote the internal memos also worried that innocent gun owners might be prosecuted and convicted. Instead of solving the problem, ATF officials announced they would perjure themselves about it.
An illustration of how far the agency can go is that some years ago there was an in-house video training shown to ATF, distributed by in-house video, called Roll Call. And in one of them, a Mr. Debussy, who is head of the National Firearms Act branch, that is registrations of machine guns and such like guns, talks about how if you want to find out if a person has a registered machine gun to him, they will give you a certificate or live testimony that he doesn't. And in it, knowing that these certifications are incredibly important, I mean, if a guy doesn't have a registration, he's guilty of a 10-year federal felony. Debussy several times says he and his agents will commit perjury to certify that their database is 100% correct, when elsewhere in the video he says some of the records are under 50% correct.
Let me say that when we testify in court, we testify that the database is 100% accurate. That's what we testify to, and we will always testify to that. As you probably well know, that may not be 100% true. If it was, if our database was absolutely error-free, we could simply run the name of the individual and his first name, and if it didn't come up, we could guarantee everyone that that individual doesn't have a Title II weapon registered to him.
But Debussy makes it very clear that they will commit perjury. And in exchange, he was, I'm told, given a different position within the agency.
How badly flawed is ATF's record of machine gun registrations? One dealer's security camera picked up his conversation with an agent while ATF was inspecting his records.
George, do you know if all those discrepancies y'all found last time were corrected in the NFTR registry?
I haven't touched nothing because of everything else.
So I'm talking about the, you know, when you were down here?
Right. Everything was accounted for, though.
So yeah, but it was like 114 errors that y'all had in the registry.
Right. Like I said, once everything else started, I stopped doing what I was doing. So.
Okay.
I just dropped it.
Okay.
But I know, but the thing is we accounted for everything. Everything was accounted for, paperwork and everything. So you've got your papers. That shows everything. All inventory was accounted for last time.
Okay. Because if you start bouncing off of Washington, it ain't gonna come back right.
You're getting your things back now quickly.
I haven't submitted anything lately.
Well.
How valuable is a registration system, even if it were accurate?
Gun registration doesn't work, and we need to get away from the idea that somehow having a registry keeps people from doing bad things. A registry of firearms owners only tells you who the good guys are that own guns. It doesn't tell you the bad guys who they are who never bought a gun through the dealers.
And ATF is not above some ordinary old-style corruption. In 1992, Miami Field Office processed invoices improperly by charging them against the wrong accounts. The Office of Inspector General found falsification of receipts and vouchers. In Chicago, a new employee contended sexual harassment began when offered employment by BATF. Again, in 1992, an agent steals cocaine obtained by search warrants. The agent gives cocaine to gang members to sell, splits the proceeds, and covers up a murder.
The problem with certain corrupt law enforcement agencies is that you can pass a point of no return. You get to a point at which, if you're an honest agent, you're hesitant to talk about dishonesty because the person you're complaining about may be friends with the person you're complaining to, or the person you're complaining about may have blackmail material, literally, on the guy you're complaining to, or the guy you're complaining to may be corrupt also. So at some point you get to where it's no longer safe for the honest people to complain. I saw evidence along those lines in several ATF cases. There were some documents from an investigation of the Chicago field office where they said the managers were managing by intimidation. Anyone who crossed them was threatened, and the agents said, if anybody does anything about it, I'll just tie them up in lawsuits to the end of my days. I saw evidence of a case 20 years ago where an agent found out that another agent was stealing guns from the confiscation locker and selling them on the streets. They bumped into each other in the elevator, and the crooked agent had an armload of guns, and the good agent said, I know just what you're doing, and I'm going to turn you in. The crooked agent said, you're just the type of guy who would drop the guns and went for his pistol. He got out of his gun first and shot off the good agent's thumb. The good agent cleared leather with his own pistol and killed the corrupt one. So what do? Man was defending his own life against a corrupt agent who was selling guns on the street. The answer was they fired him, first time for bringing bad publicity to the Bureau. He got reinstated through the Civil Service Commission. Then they fired him again for using bad judgment and shooting the other agent. He got reinstated again. Then he got transferred at every 6 months around the country until finally quit in frustration. In one place where he showed up, he found a note on his desk that said, snitches butt out. So if you have a supposed law enforcement agency where a guy who does that is considered a snitch, I mean, we're talking jailhouse terminology. Basically what you have is a criminal organization. Criminality will be covered up, and if you report it, you're just another snitch.
I believe to just acknowledge the ATF's rigging of prosecutions, there would be literally thousands of convictions that would be subject to review or possibly retrial. This would overload the American justice system, not to mention people's trust in that justice system. This is going to be a tricky fix for Congress because just to acknowledge it is liable to cause a big problem.
I extensively studied the Waco case, and after 3 or 4 years of Freedom of Information Act suits, during which ATF resistance and FBI resistance was so strong that a federal district judge labeled their conduct stonewalling, we eventually got a mass of data regarding Waco that had never seen the public eye. And even at that, the agency, I know, was covering up things. They had at least 4 video cameras aimed at the front door of the building when the raid went down, and they could only find 1 videotape. Somehow they just lost the others. Their public relations officer had a camera with which she took images. And afterwards she explained the camera and the images had vanished because the camera had been stolen from the middle of raid headquarters during the raid. Now you'd think a room full of nobody but federal and state law enforcement that someone wouldn't sneak in and steal a camera, but that was their story and they're sticking to it.
Why doesn't the government stop this abuse by the ATF?
Good question. Congress has over the years held hearings and heard about these and other abuses committed by what can only be called a rogue agency, an agency totally out of control, where agents beat innocent civilians and commit violent offenses, where law enforcement, in a phrase, thinks itself above the law. It didn't take much effort to pull the wool over the legislators' eyes.
First and foremost is a felon possessing a firearm, and we also have a recently enacted law called the Armed Career Criminal Act, which provides for a 15-year mandatory prison term for a person who has 3 felony convictions for violent felonies or serious drug offenses and is found in possession of a firearm.
Never mind that ATF's own figures showed that only a few % of its cases were against armed career criminals.
Gun Owners of America has had some direct contact with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives. Years ago, we went in to meet with one of their representatives. He was in their Congressional Relations Department. I would call him a flack catcher. He took some flack from us that day because we kept pressing him for the data behind their constant claims to Congress, justifying higher and higher budgets, that their gun registry, which is a decentralized one, it exists in dealers' books all across the country, and they can find who bought a gun and who was the last registered person to have that gun through these books that are kept at the dealers, and they must be kept for 20 years. What crimes had they ever actually solved because and only because they were able to trace a gun? Well, of course, they didn't have that information. They said they didn't keep their data that way. Well, that's not what they tell the Congress. They go and they have one or two cases where they make it look as if the existence of the gun and the tracing was somehow the reason they were able to get everything accomplished. But the truth is that when you find a perpetrator, that's when you find the gun.
Year after year, and abuse after abuse, Congress handed the agency more and more tax money. By 2005, the agency budget was verging on $1 billion. At the same time, ATF used its powers under Clinton-era legislation to put most licensed gun dealers out of business. Those that survived this purge were faced with license revocations based on technicalities.
If you're an ATF agent or inspector and want to set up a firearms dealer and revoke his license at least, it's not hard to do. I once counted that for every gun entered into a dealer's registry, by the time he fills out the acquisition sheet, the disposition sheet, and the 4473, there are over 40 blanks that have to be hand filled in, involving data or checking a box. Some have to be checked yes, some have to be checked no. So we've got 40 items hand entered. What are the odds of making a mistake in filling out complex forms by hand? Say it's 1 in 100. Human error, irreducible. That means you will have one written error for every 2.5 guns that you sell. Okay, any large FFL who's selling several thousand guns per year will therefore have thousands of paperwork errors. So you just wait until those add up, come in and charge him with paperwork errors, and move to take away his license. It's practically sitting there waiting for you to grab it.
With a shrinking number of dealers to regulate, how is the agency to justify a constantly growing budget? For one thing, it bought itself a new headquarters. The director budgeted $300,000 just for his personal office, with custom wood paneling, a hardwood floor modeled after one in the vice president's office, a disappearing television, and what he labeled a Star Wars command center. ATF's budget and its mansion-like headquarters were built upon the backs of its victims.
They spent literally thousands and thousands. I've spent over $100,000 on this deal, myself, personally, out of my pocket. Not to mention the loss of time that I've spent. I've been messing around with this for 2.5 years. And when you're under this type of investigation, you can't function. You have trouble eating, going to the bathroom, just doing normal things because you are so stressed out. The money that the government wasted, I mean literally wasted, trying to make me a criminal, and I say trying to make me a criminal because I am not a criminal, is just appalling.
You do see in agencies such as ATF an increasing, I don't know what you call a ratchet effect, where under administrations where gun ownership was viewed with disfavor, such as Clinton, the people who are anti-gun tend to advance. And they stay there through administrations which aren't particularly anti-gun. So essentially you tend to advance to the top by being anti-gun.
These kinds of things haven't ever been addressed, and the underlying laws that were unconstitutional all the while that led to these kinds of tragic events have not been dealt with, and in fact the Congress continues to give more money and more power to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
Over the years, amendment after amendment expanded the original Gun Control Act. In the 1990s, background checks came in, plus regulations on supposed armor-piercing ammunition. A long list of rifles and pistols were suddenly dubbed assault weapons and banned. In addition, ATF was empowered to put out of business most licensed dealers who didn't work out of storefront businesses. Persons subject to domestic violence restraining orders were forbidden to own guns. So were persons who pled guilty or had been convicted of misdemeanor domestic violence cases. The restraining orders might often have been issued by local judges on the barest of evidence, and the misdemeanor guilty pleas made years or decades before this change in the gun laws. Nevertheless, ATF occupied itself by seizing firearms from people who had pleaded guilty at some time in their life. One of the most egregious legislative incursions on right to arms comes in the legal phrase sporting purposes test. This phrase enables ATF to ban importation of firearms that are not recognized as having a so-called sporting purpose.
The Gun Control Act of 1968 changed a lot of things about who can own firearms, under what circumstances they can own them, how they purchase firearms, how they can transport firearms. Everything changed with that passage of that one. It was a very comprehensive law. The law also brought new terms into usage, such as sporting purpose. That was never a term that had been used before when it came to legal definitions of firearms. The passage, that one set of laws, which was quite a few pages, I couldn't even tell you how many pages off the top of my head, literally changed the entire firearms culture, the way firearms business was conducted in this country, and has changed it in ways that, quite frankly, did not provide the outcome they were looking for. The outcome they were looking for was a reduction in violent crime, a reduction in firearms-related violent crime. And that, in fact, didn't happen. In fact, just the opposite happened. There's been drastic increases in violent crime. The only thing that's really, as we've seen recently, cut violent crime has been passage of new laws allowing common citizens to carry concealed weapons. That has led to vast improvements and reductions in crime.
The sporting purpose test was created by the Gun Control Act of 1968. That was the first time that phrase appears in American law. It may have been one of the features Senator Dodd borrowed from the Nazi gun laws. The Nazi law outlawed importation of guns that weren't, in my translation, and I quote, designed for and usually used for the hunting of fair game. Dodd's Gun Control Act for America outlawed importation of guns that were not generally recognized as suitable for sporting purposes. The wording was different, but the concept was the same. The Second Amendment isn't about duck hunting or target shooting. It's about the right of citizens to defend themselves and their country against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Sporting purposes has no place in the Bill of Rights. It is precisely the guns that are restricted that are most useful for resisting tyranny and resisting terror. Terrorists don't confine themselves to firearms that have sporting purposes. And if we are to defend ourselves against them, we should not be limited to them either.
If you read the documents by the people who wrote the Constitution, their concern was that the common citizens have unrestricted access to the same firearms as the military. That was specifically written about and addressed quite a few times. Thomas Jefferson was not interested in hunting ducks, and the Constitution of the United States does not address the issue of hunting ducks. The Constitution of the United States is concerned about the people having access to the same firearms as the military. Pure and simple, end of discussion.
But there's a more fundamental question here. What purpose does BATF serve in the first place?
How is the ATF different from every other federal agency? Well, ATF is sort of unique in that it's the only agency which is charged with specifically regulating an activity that is protected by the Bill of Rights. Firearms ownership and use, the right of people to keep and bear arms. You don't have, say in the Department of Justice, a Bureau of Newspaper Truth or a Bureau of Religious Practice or anything like that. It's the only agency I can think of that is specifically designed to regulate something protected in the Bill of Rights.
Americans have a constitutional right to keep and bear arms. It's right in the Second Amendment in our Bill of Rights, right next to freedom of speech and freedom of religion. Why deregulate a constitutional right? Freedom to speak, practice religion, and to own arms were made constitutional rights precisely because the framers did not trust the government to control them. And if we, the people, were to allow the government to regulate such rights, it certainly shouldn't use a law plagiarized from Nazi statutes to do so. Americans of the greatest generation laid down their lives to put an end to Nazism. Is our own generation going to tolerate an organization devoted to enforcing a law plagiarized from the Nazis' own gun laws and in direct opposition to the American concept of a right to arms?
Can an agency like ATF and our constitutional right to keep and bear arms coexist? I think in theory they could, but in practice they can't. The impetus of the agency to keep on expanding regulation and the lack of accountability for abuses while doing it are ultimately not consistent with a general right to keep and bear arms. I think you have to make your choice. You can have one, but not both.
Either abolish the ATF or the ATF is going to abolish the Bill of Rights. It's just a matter of time.
It isn't a difficult choice. No one has ever proved that ATF's actions cut crime. A few years ago, Congress ordered ATF to establish high-intensity enforcement programs in urban areas and to determine whether such programs even affected crime. ATF reported that the programs worked. But Congress's General Accounting Office studied the ATF report and found it proved no such thing.
For JPFO's members, the choice is crystal clear. The only question is, how do we go about making it? Remember that legislators only have power because we give it to them of our own will.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives is going to continue to be a problem until particularly gun owners and the American people have made the point to elected officials that this kind of abuse of power and this kind of lawlessness of subjecting other people to the most incredible scrutiny, such as whether you put in an N instead of a no for an answer on a form, and yet they themselves don't even have written procedures that they would have to follow for themselves that they would then turn around and impose on the public, say when guns are being approved for machine gun or non-machine gun. This kind of outrage goes well beyond whether somebody thinks there ought to be guns in private possession or not. This is, do you want a government that thinks that it's above the law and that it can do just anything it wants in the name of the law, breaking the law? And the name of the law is actually the byword at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
The reality is that that's what government agencies do. They get bigger and they suck up more resources and they get more powerful. And in order to reverse that in any area, you have to have a leader in a true position of authority who has a philosophical belief that the government should not exercise so much power.
Again, who is going to stop this? If you want the answer, you. Only you can stop the ATF.
It's time we finally said no. No to abuses, no to corruption, no to waste of our taxes, and no to any legislator who says yes to those. We did without BATF and the Gun Control Act for the first 200 years of this nation, and we can do without them today.
As far as whether ATF is protecting American security, I don't see much evidence of it. You have to ask yourself, why do you have the agency in the first place? Maybe you need some regulatory inspectors to make sure that gun dealers' books are kept okay. But the enforcement function, why not give it to local police? They're the ones who know who the street criminals are. Just allow local police to make referrals of felon in possession or other gun cases to the U.S. attorneys, and the U.S. attorneys can decide whether to prosecute. Presto, you've eliminated an entire agency.
In the long run, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms needs to be abolished. There's no constitutional authority for the federal government regulating guns anywhere in the United States. You can read that Constitution as many times as you wish, and you just won't find it. In fact, you find a prohibition on anything that would infringe upon the people's right to keep and bear arms. And the way the Constitution was set up, and the way the 10th Amendment makes it very clear that it was set up, is if a power has not been delegated by we the people who formed the federal government, then that power it does not exist at the federal level, and it's not a power that they can use. And so without specific authorization to regulate firearms, there can be no Federal Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives.
The bottom line is, we don't have to put up with these abuses. It's time for 100 million gun owners to tell the BATF it's fired.
The source of every fear. What all souls would obtain. What everyone can claim. And you give me hope when they let me be, when you let me live life naturally, when I'm free to choose whether right or wrong. I'm a little wiser and I'm strong. What I must give to keep. Alive when
So what do attorneys advise if this rogue agency pays a gun owner a visit?
When the BATF shows up at your door asking questions or wanting to search your house, you should call a lawyer who knows the gun laws and your gun rights and how the BATF works. You should also talk to a lawyer who knows how guns work, so that if a representation is made to you about your guns or someone else's guns, then that lawyer will know whether the BATF is telling the truth or not. So you need a lawyer experienced both in federal court, experienced in the BATF, and experienced in how guns work in general.
So we've made the choice between having the ATF and having a Bill of Rights, and made the obvious choice. How do we go about getting rid of the agency? The key is to understand one thing. America has tens of millions of gun owners and only a couple of thousand BATF agents. We all have one vote apiece.
And the main thing is to get involved, and get involved on a local level. Don't just complain, but find other people of like minds. The internet is a marvelous communication tool to find out who's got the same problems, what's happening, and who to talk to get something done about it.
Gun owners can play a role in dealing with ATF problems of this type by essentially keeping the pressure on from the grassroots. Write letters to the editor, write your congressman if you hear about such a case. You'll probably get back a form letter, but at least he or his staff will be alerted, and if there are more letters going into him, it may perk up on the radar screen, hey, ATF's causing problems in our state again. Things like that. Anything you do to increase the visibility of an abuse serves a valid purpose.
One of the things that would help a great deal in controlling the BATF, obviously the best thing would be to eliminate it, but to control it, fines ought to be placed on the agency. Specifically, it would be written against the Attorney General, because he's ultimately the one in charge of the agency, and he's the one referenced in all of the underlying authorizations. $1,000 a day fine, $1,000 a day fine for every infraction that they commit when they don't keep the law themselves. And one of their excesses is directed toward gun dealers. They're trying to put them out of business, and they put some 200,000 out of business since the 1994 law was passed that gave them certain powers to do that. And what they're trying to do with the remaining 50, 60,000 or so is to hold up on renewals of issuing the actual certificate of their license. Now, a dealer can't order product and he can't ship product to anybody, to a gunsmith or whatever it might be, to another state where his buyer is located, without that actual certificate. He has to legally, he has to fax that piece of paper to the other federal firearms licensee, and if he doesn't have that, he basically is not in business. He can sell accessories and non-firearm items, but he can't sell firearms. And they have, at the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives, they have held up dealers' renewals. Even after they've actually renewed it, you can go on their website and see it's been renewed, but they don't send a piece of paper. And so one of the measures that we think would help correct that attitude of theirs would be a $1,000 a day fine.
I feel that this issue of the Gun Control Act of 1968 can be and should be the litmus test for anybody in Congress, whether it's the Senate or the House, as to whether they're with us or against us.
There are under 3,000 agents, and if one gun owner in 1,000 really made the abolition of federal gun control laws and BATF his litmus test for voting, it would be all over. Before anyone ever heard of the Gun Control Act or BATF, we had genuine gun freedom in this country and less crime. We can have it again, but we, you and I, have to be willing to regain our freedom.